Warning: the following show contains intelligent thoughts, well-formulated ideas, and occasional pointless banter. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello everyone and welcome to Hashing Out the Details. I am your host, D.L. Williams. Today is April the 6th, 2022. Before we move on, I want to apologize to all of you out there who listen into these episodes for my lack of uploading the last week or two. It was unfortunately a bit of a weather-related technical mishap which cost me an entirely recorded show. But since, current events are moving along at such a lightning pace lately, I figured it's better just go ahead and scrap that, move on, and go ahead and record an entirely new show today, and we're going to talk about a couple different things. First off, we're going to talk a little bit about the NCAA Men's Basketball Championship game. That was quite a doozy of a finale to March Madness between University of North Carolina and Kansas. We're going to talk a little bit about the opening day of baseball season coming up here in just another day or so. And finally, we're going to talk about, in our main topic of the evening, we're going to the crisis in inpatient mental health care in this country. There's a lot of little tidbits involved there. It's more of a crisis and an epidemic of people who have any ideas going on around them. We're going to talk about that in today's episode. So I hope you'll sit back, relax, enjoy yourself, and let's get started. Now, before I get into the main topics of the night, I'm going to mention a little something here that I think is going to be fun for me and my wife in a little less than a year now. We decided, in almost 16 years together, we've had a grand total of 3, what you might say, nights away from the family. We had one night before we got married, we went away for a night to a bed and breakfast. We had our honeymoon for 3 nights. And we had, last summer, my wife and I took a one-day jaunt to the city of Lancaster to see a show and just get away from things for the night and enjoy each other's company away from our kids and the rest of our extended family. And we enjoyed it, obviously. But in 16 years, I think we've earned something a little more. And we went ahead and booked ourselves on a cruise. Next February, we will be packing our bags and hopping on board a Norwegian cruise line vessel on our way toward the great nation of Bermuda. Hopefully to see some gorgeous water, some slightly warmer temperatures than we see in our neck of the woods come February. And, quite frankly, just a little bit of time to just be us, a couple. That's something we just don't see very much of in our lives. So, wish us luck. Hopefully none of us falls off the boat. That's a very long swim back to shore from what I understand. I'm hoping that the weather will cooperate and give us something a bit more comforting than what we normally see around here in the throes of the ice-cold times of winter. So we'll definitely have to report back on how that goes in about 10 months. So that brings us to the big sports stories of the day. The NCAA Men's Basketball Championship game was held just the other night, and it was a doozy with UNC falling to Kansas by just a couple of baskets, really at the very end. Kansas was a number 1 seed. UNC was a number 8 seed in this thing. So, on paper, this really should have been quite the walkaway for Kansas. It didn't play out that way. UNC showed a lot of heart throughout this tournament. If you want my opinion as a sports fan, as somebody who watches this type of thing consistently, I think UNC ran out of gas. I think they used up just about everything they had in the tank against Duke in the semifinals. They are blood rivals with Duke. It was a game that they had to expend an incredible amount of adrenaline and energy just to survive and win. They did that. It was a very courageous and heart-stopping victory at the end for them over their arch rivals. So I think what happened was when they ran into Kansas with a turnaround of just, barely a day and a half to get ready to play again against another number 1 seeded team, they just had very little left. And if you watch the game, they came out on fire. UNC, I think, threw everything they had at Kansas in the first half of the game. They had a 16-point lead, I think, at one point. They really jumped on them. They were full of fire and energy. And then I think what happened was the adrenaline wore off, and Kansas did the smart thing. They sat back and they waited. They just stuck around. They made sure it didn't get too far out of hand. And right around maybe 3 minutes past into the second half, you almost could have seen the entire UNC bench all holding up a sign like Ass Tank Meter that just said empty. They were spent. They had nothing emotionally left to give. Because if you watch the way they played the rest of that game as Kansas wore them down and just kept chipping at it and chipping at it and chipping at that lead until they finally took, the lead at the very end and ended up finishing the game to win the championship, there was very little energy left on the UNC side of the court. By the time there was probably 3 or 4 minutes left, they just looked spent. They had nothing left to give physically or mentally. But they stuck around. They gave it everything they had. And for that, I give them all the props in the world. I give them all the credit for surviving the tournament as an 8 seed to get all the way to the finals. They probably never should have gotten that far. They did. They can hold their heads up with absolutely no shame. But congratulations to Kansas on the national championship. And looking forward to next year. Now that brings me to the next thing I want to talk about. And that's the opening day of baseball season, which is tomorrow. Now, just about everybody has their picks, their suspicions about who's going to end up winning the World Series, etc. I believe the Dodgers are the current Vegas odds-on favorites to take home the trophy in October. I really don't think that's going to happen personally. I mean, my opinion's worth about as much as a cup of coffee and probably less. LA has had a great run over the last probably 4 or 5 years, but they looked like they came back down to earth at the end of last season. The Braves overran just about everything. I think they overperformed, to be honest, to win the World Series. But they did, and I give them all the credit for doing that. I think LA's time at the absolute top of the escalon of National League teams has come to an end. I think with these changes now, with the universal DH rule now in place, I think that's gonna pull a lot of National League powerhouses back toward the pack. I think offensive production is going to go up just a bit in the National League, and I think over the course of the season, you're going to see fans are going to start to actually like this. I mean, I know the purists are going to argue this to the end of the time, but I think it's a change that's probably time has come. I hope everybody enjoys the upcoming season. We got a long way to go till we get to October. So let's play ball. Oh, wait. I am not done yet. I am not done yet talking about baseball because I have got to mention this. Just the other day, perusing ESPN.com and looking over, the trades, etc. that were all getting made right as the season's about to start here. And there was one that caught my eye, and you're going to understand why in just a moment. You see, the Chicago White Sox traded with the Toronto Blue Jays for a catcher named Reese McGuire. Now, Reese McGuire has been up and down through the minor leagues over since probably 2016 for the Pirate system. He ended up going over to the Blue Jays, and now they've traded him for another catcher, actually, so it was kind of an even swap, but Reese McGuire's claim to fame is that in 2020, right before the COVID epidemic struck, most of the baseball teams had begun spring training. And he was caught outside of the sports complex at spring training in his car, getting jiggy with it. And he was eventually cited and fined, I think, like $500 or something like that. And, of course, the jokes came flying in, like, just imagine the pitcher who has to catch the balls that he throws back every time. He's got to know what hand he threw it with. But here's where it gets the most amusing in my mind. Now, it's hard enough to be the guy who got caught doing that, okay? But I want you to think about the poor guy who got who was traded for him. Like, which is worse, being the guy who got caught getting jiggy with it in his car outside of the spring training baseball field, or the guy whose team traded him away for the man who got caught getting jiggy with it outside the field during spring training? it leaves a little bit to be wondered there. And maybe it's just my sense of humor. Maybe there's something just wrong with me that I just find that really funny. But another baseball season is upon us. I hope everybody enjoys. And I'm going to take a break for just a moment or two and catch my breath. And we will move on to another story in just a second here. Be right back. Okay, thanks for hanging with me there. We're back. So, what we're going to talk about now is a very interesting story I came across the other day. For those of you who don't know me, which is pretty much anyone listening, I have a personal interest in all things history, and by association, archaeology and anthropology are favorite subjects of mine to read about. And what I came across was an article in an online magazine called Heritage Daily, which is a magazine for archaeology and anthropology and sociology nuts like me. And there's a lot of interesting little stories in there about, archaeological discoveries that are going on around the world, underwater archaeology and different studies and things like that. And in any case, there was an article that was just published, and what seems to have happened is they found in England evidence of a crucifixion, a Roman-style crucifixion, in the remains of a skeleton found in an archaeological dig that was focused on a Roman period village in the United Kingdom, in England. And from a lot of people don't realize or just haven't been really educated on it, ancient Rome had many outposts going up north. And they had a number of these outposts in what we now call England. Matter of fact, that's where St. Patrick came from. He was a Roman citizen in a Roman village in what we now call England. At that time, they called it Britannia. Now, near the village of Cambridgeshire in England, again, they were excavating this Roman-era village. And what they came across was a skeleton, which still had around its wrists and ankles, they were completely oxidized, but they were shackles. And in both of the ankle bones were found iron spikes, roughly 9 inches long each, both of which were found to have bent ends. These are consistent with the very few and rare skeletal remains that they've been able to find, which showed the results of crucifixion. Unlike, I think it's the 2 or 3 they've been able to locate in the Middle East, such as, Israel, Jerusalem, that area, or even into Babylonian territory, which at that time was under the control of the Romans as well. Unlike them, these also had spikes in the bones bore the marks of spikes in the wrist areas. Now, most people know from pop culture and most of the TV specials you see these types of things around Easter time every year where they talk about the reality of a crucifixion and that type of thing. They know that the average crucifixion did not involve spikes applied to the wrists. Instead, the spikes were generally driven through the ankles to hold them to the post, and ropes were used to suspend them by their wrists and upper arms to hold them up, and eventually resulting in asphyxiation because you had to use your feet, which were spiked to timber, to push yourself up and take a breath. The positioning was excruciating and usually took quite a while to kill you, but the Romans were experts at it. But never before has there ever been any archaeological find which found evidence of this practice outside of that very limited geographical territory. This seemed to be a crucifixion taking place in the Roman style in a Roman village all the way up in present-day England. So this means that the practice of crucifixion wasn't limited to those specific cultures that we find in the Middle East, such as in Israel and that type of thing. Apparently this was also taking place in more Germanic and Anglo-Saxon areas that the Romans had outposts in as well. This village also seemed to have a large mass burial site, so there's some suspicion as to what exactly happened in this village. Like, I believe the article said that there was anywhere between 140 and 180 skeletons found that were all mass buried. But this one was unlike in, say, the Middle East where they use ossuaries and bone fragments were found where the skeletal remains might have been buried in a box or something like that. This was literally put into the ground, still shackled. They likely simply took his body down and tossed him in a hole. But due to the unique peat and acidic qualities of British soil, the skeletal remains remained relatively intact. I mean, they were able to pretty definitively identify this as a 25 to 30-year-old male weighing somewhere between 145 and 170 pounds. And crucifixion was known to be something that was done either to slaves, lower, very low on the totem pole, of the economic scale caste individuals, and for dissidents. I mean, this would be something that whoever this person was somebody who the Roman authorities, even all the way in this remote outpost, found to be an insurrectionist. This person was obviously regarded as a traitor and a troublemaker to the Roman crown. So I found that to just be, quite frankly, I found it to be awesome that they found this. As somebody who's a student of history, and this really expands what we thought we knew, because what they've dated this village at was somewhere between 180 and 270 AD. The only reports we have of Roman crucifixions are taking place in the very late BC to maybe 100 years AD time frame. Those are the spans of time that we have a real historical record of. It's not even mentioned really in the historical record once you get into that post 100 AD time frame. To see here evidence of one taking place geographically, quite frankly, far from home for the Roman Empire, but also at this later date, gives us somewhat of a clue into what the Roman Empire was still, how the Roman Empire was still functioning on a justice, on a manner of dealing with dissident citizens and dissident individuals, even, possibly 180 years to 200 years after the birth of Christ. Interesting stuff. I suspect strongly that as archaeologists continue to do these kinds of studies and these kinds of excavations into these outposts that were so far from the base point of the Roman Empire, and probably even when you get into the Byzantine Empire time frames as well, you're going to start to see more and more of the stuff that the histories that we think we have are very incomplete. We think we know so much, and we really haven't even begun to scratch the surface. Something as simple as this has the British Archaeological Society doing, cartwheels and jumping up and down. And honestly, I'd be willing to bet that, 1800 years ago or whatever that happened, this is just an ordinary day at the park for these folks. It was just their daily life. And we have no idea that it was happening even then. My hope is that you found that story interesting. I sure did. All right, I'm going to take just another break here, and we'll be back to talk about the mental health care crisis in the United States. Stay tuned. Okay, and welcome back as we get to our main story of the week. There is an epidemic in the United States, and it's not COVID alone. There is an extreme collapse going on around us in a particular medical field, and it's the field of psychiatry and the field of mental health care in the United States of America. Most people have no idea that this is going on around them, but we're going to get a little bit of a crash course in just what it is and how it's happening and why it's happening. To understand anything, I am a firm believer that you really need to know how you got to the point you're at before you can even think about a solution. Like just about everything, this all started about money. Back in the late 1990s, the public image of mental hospitals and mental health care was one flew over the cuckoo's nest. If you said mental hospital to your average person on the street, they saw electroshock therapy and lobotomies and things that had been incredibly run out of practice for decades by that particular point. But that's what the public image of it still was. So the public still had, at that point, and even right through today, a certain stigma that came along with the territory of mental health issues. Present figures indicate that 1 in every 4 people suffers some form of mental health problem in their daily life. On the whole, this is generally seen in the form of depression, anxiety issues. Anxiety issues are a spectrum, and so is depression. Just about everything is viewed on a spectrum these days. There are people who worry about everything, and there are people who crumble due to anxiety. That's the difference in how these things are viewed by the mental health community. Now, going back to the mid-90s when Bill Clinton was still president and the clamor was up for a balanced budget, they wanted to eliminate the deficits in United States government spending. The way that was conceived to attempt to cut costs at the top of the line was funding for what we call payer system. Okay. Now, this is obviously things like Medicaid, government-issued Medicaid programs, things like that, were at the top of the chopping block to get shaved. Not eliminated, but shaved. Now, the first thing they decided to do to cut costs was to cut funding to teaching hospitals, especially in the psychiatric variety. Now, anybody who knows anything about how you become a doctor is that after you graduate medical school, you have to intern and do a residency geared around your particular field of practice that you're getting into. Now, if you want to be an OBGYN, well, then you have to go and be an intern and a resident at an OBGYN office. If you want to be a hospitalist, then you have to go and work in a hospital. If you want to be, an RN or something, the same thing, okay? But a lot of these specialty fields, you must go and do your residency and internship in a teaching hospital. For anybody who's ever seen the show House, that show is about a teaching hospital. They have, that they are there to learn from a senior physician and to get experience in infectious disease and analyzation of unknown medical problems. That's how that show was geared around. But it gives you an idea of what a teaching hospital is. A lot of people don't know what they are. Psychiatric mental hospitals of the teaching variety have been rare to begin with. Most states in 1995 had perhaps 3 or 4 in an entire state. Funding to those facilities, which, because the doctors fundamentally working in them were students, they couldn't charge as much for somebody to be in them. So a lot of the funding for those hospitals came from the government to ensure future doctors were certified and properly educated and licensed to practice psychiatry. Well, when they started shaving funding off of those types of hospitals, it dramatically curtailed the number of individuals who could get into them as a student psychiatrist and eventually become a licensed practicing psychiatrist. When that situation became untenable, individuals, especially Americans, going into the psychiatric medical field dramatically collapsed. When I say dramatically, it dropped something like 78%, according to the Journal of American Psychiatric Services. From 2000, if you read the ratings from 1990 to 2000, the number of individuals admitted as an intern or resident to teaching psychiatric facilities dropped 78%. So, obviously that means we were producing a lot less new psychiatrists. This problem was countered by the United States government offering tax breaks and actually funding for foreign psychiatrists to come here and practice, which makes a lot of sense for folks now when they look around and realize that it's really hard to find a native-born American psychiatrist anymore. And this is why this has happened, because the American government made it nearly impossible to get into a teaching hospital of psychiatric care to become a psychiatrist as a Native American. There was something I was reading in the same journal that said that right now Canada is importing Americans to study in their psychiatric teaching hospitals more than their own. which makes sense, is Canada has a dramatically lower population, but it just simply means that Americans are going to Canada to become psychiatrists, and we're importing them from other countries. So obviously that certainly gives a feeling of a brain drain that's going on in our American-based psychiatric future. Okay, so we know that step one, we now have a reduction in the number of doctors available. That's the beginning of a problem. Now, the second part is, it goes back to what I had mentioned about how John Q. Public has, or had at least, and still to a certain measure, has a view of mental hospitals, actual inpatient facilities as being, one flew over the cuckoo's nest style, with people getting lobotomies and straitjackets and that type of thing. And that has not been the case since long before I was born, to be honest with you. People envision the old state institutions. The story that was famously done by Geraldo Rivera back in the day both saved mental health care and destroyed it. Because what people don't realize is that was not mental health care. You see, in those days, mentally ill people were stored in these institutions. But different types of mental problems were all lumped together. There was no societally approved or based programs to provide living arrangements for the mentally handicapped. And they were stored in those warehouse type environments. Just like now, government funding was shaved left and right from those facilities, and it caused an epidemic of shortage of workers and individuals to care for all those individuals. That's, in a lot of ways, what we're starting to see again. But from a slightly different angle. See, what's happening now is this. You have reduced numbers of hospitals due to society and government policy being steered toward the idea of get everyone out in the community. That an individual with a mental health problem is best able to heal and function if they're given the most possible freedom, the most possible opportunity to be out in the community with everyone else, and that in and of itself should be the goal of all mental health treatment. That mantra sounds lovely. It really does. And if it were that simple, we'd all be better off. It isn't that simple, folks. You see, on television, where most people get their information and form their opinions, the only mental health problems you ever encounter or see are things such as depression, again, anxiety, the types of mental health issues that you can live with, that you pop a pill and it just might get you through the day. But it's not just depression. It's not just anxiety. There are mental illnesses out there, folks, like bipolar, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, sexual dissociative issues. There are a host of mental health problems, which according to the American Psychiatric Association accounts for roughly 40% of American mental health diagnoses. Those numbers are large numbers of people, and they cannot be effectively treated on an outpatient basis consistently. There are people who need to be occasionally given inpatient care, and by that I mean in a facility that allows them to be observed and a legitimate treatment plan formulated around them to facilitate some level of recovery and care. That brings us to the next point. When the hospitals started being closed down by the government, one, to save the government money, two, because society had decided that state hospitals were a bad place, their function was taken over by privately owned healthcare systems who created their own psychiatric units. But what we've seen in the last 25 years is the payer systems, such as Medicaid, have begun short-tracking mental health care. What I mean by that is that they have instituted policies which make proper care of an individual suffering from a mental health problem virtually impossible. Here's a perfect example. There is a regulation in place that states that if an individual, even a voluntary any individual who's taken into a mental health facility must be fully evaluated and a plan for discharge initiated within no more than 48 hours. 48 hours to observe, diagnose, formulate a plan for discharge, and execute it, more or less. Impossible. I want you to imagine the following scenario. I'm having a terrible breakdown, a nervous breakdown, they used to call them. I have a complete and total meltdown. I am no longer truly lucid. I am out of control. I can't think straight. I'm suicidal. Somebody calls the police. They come and they talk to me, and I'm not making any sense. I'm just so depressed, and I'm not lucid. I am not making good, logical, reasonable sense, and I am a danger to myself because I'm stating that I wish to kill myself. Now, if I can be convinced that I need to take a stop and go into a facility, a mental hospital, for a little while, just so they can help me get a little better, and I agree to it, what happens if I do it on a Friday night? I go and sign myself into a mental hospital on a Friday night. Guess who works in hospitals on the weekends, folks? Doctors who are moonlighting. The regular physicians are going to be checking in at best. I'm there in the mental hospital. Some doctor who's only pulling an extra shift because it's a couple extra bucks that weekend stops by, takes a peek in at me, looks at a record from the whoever admitted me, writes a signature on it. His shift is done. He's never going to see me again. Then another one does the same thing for the next couple hours, along with everybody else who's there in that hospital at the time. And then another. I've now been there for 24 hours. Where was the time to observe me, to talk to me, to find out what's really happening inside my head, and then to formulate a treatment plan? Are those moonlighters sitting down and working out what drugs might be best for me? Are they going to have the time and the wherewithal and everything else to sit down and formulate a plan of, okay, how much better do we need to get this person to where they can walk out those doors and not end up right back here again? Do you think you can do that in 48 hours? Are you positive? Because that's the government regulation. 48 hours. That's your maximum amount of time to observe, formulate a plan, and begin its execution to get them out. In the last 20 years, the average stay in a mental hospital has gone from 12 weeks to 4 days. Doesn't that sound ludicrous? Could you imagine somebody making a regulation that tells a cardiologist that you have 36 hours to do your heart surgery, figure out everything that could possibly be done to fix it, and get this guy out of here? Just imagine that. If that man walked out and had a heart attack, you would have the biggest negligence lawsuit in history on that doctor. But if a psychiatrist in a mental hospital gets you to just say, I'm not upset anymore, they then have to discharge you. You walk out the door, realize that, man, I am really in a bad way, and jump in front of a bus, your family's going to be upset. Your friends are going to be upset. Any doctor worth their salt is going to know that you should never have been let back out that quickly. But the doctor who signed your discharge followed every rule and followed every strategy that they want them to follow to the T. They did exactly what they were supposed to do by the way things are done now. Does that sound logical or reasonable to anyone? I can't imagine anyone who would see that. So here we are. That's part 3 of our problem. We've got the financial problem. We've got the lack of new doctors coming down the pipeline. We've got a change in strategy from reparative mental health care to fast-track mental health care. And now we're going to get to the fun one. Availability of beds in inpatient facilities. Due to the incredible decrease in state and federally funded, publicly owned facilities, the mass majority, almost exclusively to this point, all psychiatric facilities are privately owned through medical care groups. And as such, they're for profit, obviously. There is less money to be made in the psychiatric field than in most physical medical practice type facilities. You're never going to make as much working with a schizophrenic in their care as you're going to a cardiac patient. So they simply don't open as many. This has led to an incredible drought in availability of open beds. According to Psychiatry Today, which is another medical journal, there is an average wait time of anywhere from 6 to 62 days for a open bed in a mental health facility, an inpatient mental health facility, depending greatly on the specific area you're in. The problem is far worse in the northeast and the southeast as opposed to the northwest. And the southwest and deep south parts of the U.S. tend to fall in the longer range as well. But it seems like the worst of it is the East Coast, and the best case scenario is going to be your Pacific Northwest as far as availability of an open bed when needed in an inpatient facility. That's frightening, folks, because what that means is most people, because the regulations say they can't hold you more than 3 days without being a consistent danger, because that's the entire criteria for admission to a mental health facility anyhow, is you have to be dangerous to yourself or others. That's the sole criteria. If you go into a crisis center, at an emergency room or something like that, and you're talking to the sky and you're seeing things coming out of your hands, if the attending physician says, "Do you want to hurt yourself or anybody else?" and your answer is no, they're going to turn you around and walk you right back out the door. You need help, and you can't get it unless you tell them you want to hurt yourself or somebody else. And so what happens is the standard, and I mean this is actually standard operating procedure. There's I guess you might call it a mantra of sorts, that is the basic standard guiding principle behind mental health care, and it goes something like this. The sole focus of psychiatric inpatient treatment is based on the mantra of safety and crisis stabilization. What that simply means is they're looking for the following criteria to be met is the sign that care is no longer needed. You are simply no longer a stated danger to the safety of self or others. Let me tell you how this looks in real life. And I can tell you this from personal experience, and I know for a fact I've spoken to a number of people in the field, and they all say this is standard practice. You have an individual who comes into, say, an emergency room or something to that effect, and they're having a crisis of some variety. They're suicidal, they're possibly homicidal, anything like that. So they come in, and they'll put them in a safe room, and they will give them pretty strong doses of, say, Ativan or some other form of sedative, and they'll wait for that to take effect. And then a doctor will come along sooner or later and ask that person who's now pretty well sedated, "Do you want to hurt yourself?" And of course, somebody who's now, shot up with Ativan or something else like that is going to open an eye up and look at them in a nice little happy, medication-induced euphoria, and they're going to say, "No, I don't want to hurt myself." And they're going to say, "Do you want to hurt anybody else?" "Nope, I'm good." And they're going to say, "Okay, discharge." That person is going to walk back out of that hospital, and in a couple hours, all that stuff they gave them is going to wear off. And they're no different than they were before they walked into the place. That is what the psychiatric treatment mantra of safety and crisis stabilization for inpatient care criteria really means. That's what's happening in our hospitals and our facilities every single day. That's not only tragic for those who are suffering from these problems, it is a danger to society. And I'd say you'd be hard-pressed to convince me I'm wrong. Because based on those criteria, you only need them to say they're not wanting to hurt themselves or somebody else just one time, and they're good. You can release them now. You have taken somebody who is in a healthcare facility wanting to be treated for a severe, acute, dangerous problem, and you're essentially running a U-turn and getting them right back out of the building just as fast as you can, because that's the treatment model. That's insane. But it is how the system is set up now. That brings me to my last part of the problem. It works like this. So now you've got a lack of facilities. You have a lack of doctors. You've got reduced capacity to care for them because of a tragically flawed principle in the system of this, safety and crisis stabilization pattern, model of treatment. Now you got everybody being funneled to outpatient services. Of course, in plain English, that means they want you to go see a psychiatrist or counseling and perhaps medication and that type of thing, so that you're not in the facility. They want everybody treated outside of facilities. They want you to be out in the community, remember? But trying to get outpatient care is becoming even harder and harder to come by now. Did you know that the average wait to see a psychiatrist for the first time is over 60 days? And in some places as much as 120 days. I was reading in another article in, where are we at here? The Annals of Emergency Medicine, which is an international medical journal. This might be my favorite article I've read in the last couple of months in any kind of medical journal. A group of mental health care workers, including 12 doctors, 14 registered nurses, 16 LPNs, and 2 attorneys who were working with them, decided to run a test of sorts. Now, they did this in the Boston area in Massachusetts. They proceeded to act like they were someone who had been discharged from an emergency room the day before for having a suicidal meltdown, and that they were discharged from the hospital over, in the night before, after being evaluated and given that they were stabilized and sent on their merry way, and their discharge instructions were to get a appointment with a psychiatrist within 2 weeks. They proceeded to call all 69 programs or facilities within a 40-mile radius of downtown Boston. So you're talking a major metropolitan area. Every single facility it existed in that area for this purpose, for psychiatric care. Of the 69 facilities that were called, 2 were able to offer them an appointment within the 2-week parameter. 2 out of 69. And this is the best part of it. The 2 that offered the appointment would only do so if you could pay cash, because they do not accept any insurance. Do you want to know why they don't accept any insurance? Because starting in 2006, every major private insurance company followed suit with how Medicaid and the federal government handles their payments to mental health care facilities, and that they're paying out on average of 71 cents for every dollar that's spent by the hospital or facility for care. So, running a mental health care facility is a money-losing endeavor. And you want to know why these private companies that are running all this are not opening more? Because it's losing money. They're only able to get back 71 cents on every dollar. Basically, every insurance company is now playing this, well, here's what we're going to pay you, take it or leave it, game with regards to mental health care in this country. That is terrifying. Just imagine that. 71 cents on the dollar. For every dollar billed, they might be willing to pay out 71 cents on that dollar. Okay? You're losing money. Every facility. So, going back to that study, 69 facilities contacted. 2 of them offered an appointment if you paid cash. The results of the other 69 were 4 facilities offered an appointment 6 weeks, 3 of them offered an appointment in 10 weeks, and the rest couldn't offer anything before 4 months. For someone who just had a suicidal breakdown, 4 months is not a lifetime. It's 4 months of lifetime. Days and days and days lost in hopelessness. Folks, this is a life or death situation here, okay? How bad the situation has gotten. And people don't even know it. They don't even know that this is happening. Because if it's not happening to them and they don't see it on the nightly news and they don't see it talked about on some talk show or something someplace, nobody has a clue. Why aren't we seeing this talked about? You know why? There's no money in it. You're going to get up there and, I'm telling you the truth, this is a fact. You're going to get up there in front of, your state senate and say, we want more money for mental health care facilities, where most of the folks who are going to get admitted for care are people who might be on disability or might be individuals who struggle holding a job because of these problems they're having. Why? Because to them, they're throwing money down a black hole. They're not worried about this. But then you start hearing about how every single time you hear about one of these mass murders, these shooters and stuff, it's always somebody who had usually a history of mental health problems. And you don't see them doing anything to stop this, do you? Because it comes down to money. How much money is your kid's life worth with some school shooter? How much money is your husband or your wife's life worth if they're stuck in the middle of a mall when somebody just cracked and starts shooting or driving a car around through a crowd? Because I'm not talking about guns, I'm talking about a mental health problem that makes you do things that you wouldn't do if you were in your right mind. These things can be faced head on, but they're not going to do it like this. This is a train wreck, and it's real close to going off the tracks now. And it's going to take people with it. These things don't end well. So I hope somebody out there hears this with the power to talk to people that count. I have long said that I really wish I had the capability to start like a lobbying group or something like that, better and more access to mental health care in this country, because it's just horrifying. I really hope somebody out there hears this. And you know what? They're probably not. I doubt anybody who is listening to this is going to be a state senator or a representative someplace who can talk to somebody who's got the power to do anything about this, who's got the power to pick up a pen and write things that matter. But I will say this. There might be somebody out there whose sister or brother or kid or their spouse is suffering from these problems and has gone through this. I want you to know you're not alone in this. Others of us have gone through this and are going through this too. You're not by yourself. It's not just you. The system is terribly broken. It is flawed. It is broken. And I hope someday, somewhere, somehow, somebody out there has enough willpower and the heart to step up and take this on. Because this is a systemic problem. It's not a person. This is a problem 30 or 40 years in the making, and it's not going to end well if we don't do something about it. So that about wraps up what time I have for today. I thank you all for joining me on Hashing Out the Details. I have been your host, D.L. Williams. I want to leave you with this quote, just one last thing for the night, and that is, to know that we know what we do know, that is knowledge. But it is also knowledge to know that which we do not know. Have yourselves a great week. Good night.